The train lurched to a stop in Rawhide, Nevada, and Louise Ramsey pressed her frozen fingers against the frost-covered window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared at the desolate platform where her future husband was supposed to be waiting. December 1883 had brought an unusually bitter cold to this harsh desert town, and the snowflakes that drifted through the air seemed as lost as she felt, falling where they had no business being. She clutched the worn photograph of Marcus Thornton in her trembling hand, the man who had sent for her from Boston 3 months ago with promises of a comfortable home and a respectable life as the wife of a successful merchant. Louise gathered her threadbare coat tighter around her slender frame and stood, smoothing down the best dress she owned, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days but was clean and pressed. At 22 years old, she had left behind nothing but poverty and the cold charity of distant relatives who had made it clear she was a burden they could no longer afford. The mail-order bride arrangement had seemed like providence, an answer to prayers whispered in the dark of sleepless nights. She lifted her single carpetbag and made her way down the narrow aisle, her heart hammering against her ribs. The conductor helped her down the metal steps, and the wind hit her like a physical blow, cutting through her inadequate coat and stealing the breath from her lungs. The platform was nearly empty except for a portly man in an expensive wool coat, standing beside a tall, elegant woman whose fur-trimmed cape and haughty expression spoke of wealth and position. Louise recognized Marcus immediately from the photograph, though he was stouter in person, and his expression far less kind than the neutral pose had suggested. She walked toward him, her legs shaking from both cold and nerves, and managed a smile that she hoped looked warm despite her chattering teeth. "Mr. Thornton, I am Louise Ramsey. I am so pleased to finally meet you." Marcus Thornton looked her up and down with the calculating gaze of a man inspecting livestock at market, and Louise watched his expression shift from curiosity to disappointment to something close to disgust. The woman beside him leaned in and whispered something that made his mouth tighten into a hard line. "You are not at all what I expected," Marcus said coldly, his voice carrying easily across the platform. Several other people had gathered to witness the arrival of the mail-order bride, as such events were entertainment in a small town, and Louise felt their eyes boring into her back. "The photograph you sent was clearly taken many years ago, and you failed to mention your circumstances were quite so desperate." Louise felt her cheeks burn despite the cold. "Sir, the photograph was taken only last year, and I have been entirely honest in all my correspondence. I have worked as a seamstress and housekeeper, and I can manage a household efficiently. I am healthy and hardworking and willing to be a good wife to you." The elegant woman beside Marcus laughed, a cold tinkle of sound that held no mirth. "Marcus, you cannot possibly be considering going through with this. Look at her. She is practically in rags and she looks half-starved. What would people think?" Marcus straightened his shoulders and addressed Louise as though she were a stranger asking for directions, rather than the woman who had traveled 2,000 miles to marry him. "Miss Ramsey, I am afraid there has been a terrible mistake. You are clearly not suitable to be my wife. I require a woman of refinement and means, someone who can represent my business interests properly in society. I cannot marry you." The world seemed to tilt beneath Louise's feet, and for a moment she thought she might actually faint. She had spent every penny she had on the train ticket, following his detailed instructions. She had no money for lodging, no funds to purchase a return ticket, and knew no one in this God-forsaken town. The temperature was dropping rapidly as evening approached, and already her feet were numb in her thin leather boots. "But sir, we had an agreement," Louise said, hating the desperate tremor in her voice. "I have come all this way. I have nowhere else to go." "That is hardly my concern," Marcus replied, turning away. "Perhaps you can find work in town, though I doubt it. The Silver Dollar Saloon is always looking for girls, I believe." The way he said it made clear exactly what kind of work he meant, and Louise felt humiliation wash over her in burning waves. The woman took Marcus's arm possessively, and Louise understood with sudden clarity that this had never been about the photograph or her appearance at all. Marcus Thornton had found someone else, someone with money or connections, and Louise was simply an inconvenience to be brushed aside. They walked away together, leaving her standing alone on the platform as the train's whistle blew and it began to pull away from the station. Louise stood frozen, watching her last possible means of escape disappear down the tracks. The few onlookers dispersed quickly, unwilling to offer help or even sympathy to a rejected bride. The shame of it was almost worse than the cold, though the cold was becoming a serious concern. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she had not been fighting down panic. She forced herself to think practically. She needed shelter immediately. She needed to find work. She needed to survive. Louise picked up her carpetbag and started walking down the main street of Rawhide, her eyes scanning the buildings for anything that might offer hope. The town was larger than she had expected, prosperous from the nearby silver mines. There were several shops, 2 hotels, a bank, a church, and yes, the Silver Dollar Saloon with its brightly painted facade and the sound of piano music drifting through the doors. She tried the hotels first, but without money for even a single night's lodging, she was turned away immediately. The boarding house matron took one look at her and shut the door firmly. Louise stopped in front of the general store, gathering her courage, and went inside. The warmth of the pot-bellied stove hit her like a blessing, and she had to resist the urge to simply collapse beside it. A middle-aged woman behind the counter looked up from her ledger. "Can I help you?" "I am looking for work," Louise said, trying to keep her voice steady and professional. "I am an excellent seamstress and I can keep accounts. I am also experienced in housekeeping and cooking." The woman's expression softened slightly with sympathy, and Louise realized she must have witnessed the scene at the train station. "I am sorry, but I have no positions available. My husband and I run this store ourselves, and we barely make enough to support our own family." Louise thanked her and left, trying 3 more establishments with the same result. As darkness fell completely and the temperature plummeted further, she found herself back on the main street with nowhere to go. Her fingers were so cold she could barely feel them, and her feet felt like blocks of ice. She was genuinely afraid now, understanding that she could freeze to death on these streets if she did not find shelter. The church was locked, but there was a small covered area near the back, and Louise huddled there against the wall, trying to shield herself from the wind. She pulled everything from her carpetbag and layered on the 2 extra dresses she owned, wrapping a shawl around her head and clutching another against her chest. It helped, but not enough. Her whole body shook violently with shivering, and her thoughts were beginning to blur at the edges in a way that frightened her. She must have dozed or lost consciousness for a while, because the next thing she knew, someone was shaking her shoulder gently. Miss, you cannot sleep out here. You will die." Louise forced her eyes open to see a man crouched beside her, concern evident in his weathered face despite the darkness. He was tall and lean, dressed in worn denim pants and a heavy sheepskin coat, with a dark hat pulled low against the cold. Even through her confusion, she noticed his eyes were a striking blue-green, like the ocean she had crossed when her family had immigrated from Ireland when she was a child. "I have nowhere to go," Louise managed to say through chattering teeth. "No money." The man did not hesitate. "Can you stand? I am going to take you somewhere warm." He helped her to her feet, and Louise's legs nearly gave out. The man caught her easily, surprisingly strong despite his lean build, and he picked up her carpet bag with his other hand. "My name is Kane Quincy. I work at the Running Q Ranch just outside town. The owner's wife passed recently, and he needs someone to help with the house and his daughter. The pay is not much, but it includes room and board. If you want the position, I can take you there tonight." Louise could barely process what he was saying, but she understood the essential facts. Warmth, shelter work. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." Kane led her to where his horse was tied outside the saloon, a sturdy bay gelding with kind eyes. He mounted first, then pulled Louise up in front of him, wrapping his coat around both of them and holding her securely against his chest. She should have been mortified by the intimacy, but she was too cold and too grateful to care. His body heat seeped into her gradually as they rode through the dark streets and out onto the open range. "How did you know I was there?" Louise asked, her voice muffled against his chest. "I saw what happened at the train station," Kane said quietly. "I had business in town and I heard Marcus Thornton making a spectacle of himself. I am sorry that happened to you. He is a pompous fool, always has been. But I had to finish my errands before I could come looking for you. I was worried I might not find you in time. You were looking for me. I knew you would have nowhere to go, and I knew about the position at the ranch. It seemed like it might work out for both of you if you were willing." His arms tightened slightly around her. "You are going to be all right now." Louise felt tears sting her eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed since Marcus's rejection. This stranger's kindness undid something in her chest that pride and fear had held together. She let herself lean against him, accepting the shelter he offered, and tried to believe his words. The ride seemed to take forever, though it was probably only half an hour. Louise drifted in and out of awareness, exhausted and still dangerously cold despite the warmth of Kane's body. When they finally arrived at the ranch, she roused enough to see a sprawling house with lamplight glowing in the windows, surrounded by several outbuildings and corrals. Kane dismounted and lifted her down carefully, then guided her up the porch steps and through the front door. The warmth inside was overwhelming, and Louise gasped as her frozen skin began to thaw. A stocky man with iron-gray hair and a weathered face looked up from the fireplace, surprise crossing his features. "Kane, what is going on?" "This is Louise Ramsey," Kane said, supporting her with an arm around her waist. "She is the mail-order bride that Marcus Thornton rejected today. I thought she might be suitable for the position you need filled." The older man's expression shifted to understanding and then to sympathy. "Lord have mercy. Come in, come in. Let us get you warm, miss." He pulled a chair close to the fire and Kane helped her into it, then disappeared briefly before returning with a thick quilt that he wrapped around her shoulders. "I am Thomas Quinn," the older man said, pronouncing it the Irish way that rhymed with twin. "This is my ranch, and this young man is my nephew Kane Quincy. My wife Margaret passed 3 months ago, God rest her soul, and I have been struggling to manage the house and care for my daughter Sarah. She is 12 years old and needs a woman's guidance. I can offer you $30 a month plus room and board if you are willing to keep house, cook, and help raise Sarah. It is hard work, and Sarah has been difficult since losing her mother, but we would treat you with respect." $30 a month was more than Louise had made in Boston, and room and board meant security. She would have accepted half as much. "I would be honored to accept the position, Mr. Quinn. I promise I will work hard," Thomas smiled, deep lines crinkling around his eyes. "I believe you will. You look exhausted and half frozen. Kane, show her to the spare room. We can discuss details in the morning. There is stew left from dinner. I will heat some up." Kane led Louise through the house, and even in her exhausted state, she could see it was well built and comfortable, though it bore the signs of being kept by men without a woman's touch. The spare room was small but clean, with a narrow bed covered in quilts and a small dresser. "The stove in the kitchen will keep this room warm enough," Kane said, setting her carpet bag down. "There is a washstand there, and I will bring you hot water. Take your time getting settled." Louise sank onto the bed, relief making her weak. Kane returned a few minutes later with a pitcher of hot water and a clean towel, and then Thomas appeared with a bowl of beef stew and thick slices of bread. Louise's stomach cramped with hunger at the smell, and she realized she had not eaten since early morning. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Both of you. I do not know what would have happened if you had not found me, Mr. Quincy." "Just Kane," he said with a slight smile, "and you do not need to thank me. No decent man would leave someone to freeze." He paused in the doorway. "Welcome to the running queue, Louise. I think you will do just fine here." After they left, Louise ate the stew slowly, letting the warmth spread through her body. She washed her face and hands, changed into her nightgown, and crawled under the quilts. The bed was more comfortable than anything she had slept on in years, and she was safe and warm with the promise of honest work ahead. As she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was of Kane Quincy's steady gaze and the gentle way he had wrapped his coat around her, sharing his warmth without hesitation. Louise woke to bright sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee and bacon. For a disoriented moment, she could not remember where she was, and then the events of the previous day came flooding back. She dressed quickly in her best work dress, a gray cotton that was plain but practical, and braided her dark hair into a neat coronet around her head. Her reflection in the small mirror showed a pale face with shadows under her hazel eyes, but at least she no longer looked half frozen. She found the kitchen by following the sounds and smells and discovered Thomas at the stove, doing his best with the bacon but clearly not entirely comfortable with the task. He looked up with relief when she entered. "Good morning, Miss Ramsey. I hope you slept well." "I am afraid I am not much of a cook. Please call me Louise, and I slept wonderfully, thank you." She moved forward automatically, assessing the kitchen with a practiced eye. "Let me help you with that." Thomas gladly stepped aside, and Louise took over the cooking with the ease of long practice. She finished the bacon, scrambled eggs with a bit of cheese she found in the cold box, and made more coffee. She was setting the table when a young girl appeared in the doorway, regarding Louise with open suspicion. Sarah Quinn had her father's gray eyes and her mother's delicate features, captured in a photograph on the mantel that Louise had noticed the night before. She wore a simple dress that needed mending, and her blonde hair was tangled as though she had not brushed it properly in days. "Who are you?" "This is Louise Ramsey," Thomas said gently. "She is going to be helping us around the house for a while. Louise, this is my daughter Sarah." "I do not need anyone to help me," Sarah said defensively. "I am not a baby." "Of course you are not," Louise said calmly, continuing to set out plates. "But your father hired me to help with the housework, which I am grateful for since I need the employment. I hope we can be friends." Sarah did not respond, but she sat down at the table when her father gestured for her to do so. Kane appeared a moment later, stamping snow off his boots just outside the door before entering. He hung his hat and coat on the pegs by the door and nodded to Louise. "Good morning." "Good morning," Louise replied, suddenly aware of her worn dress and the flour smudge she probably had on her cheek from making biscuits. In the clear morning light, she could see Kane more clearly than she had the night before. He was probably around 30 years old, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at his collar, and those remarkable blue-green eyes that seemed to see more than most people. His face was tanned from outdoor work, with strong features that stopped just short of handsome, saved from plainness by the intelligence in his gaze and the hint of humor around his mouth. They sat down to breakfast together, and Louise noticed that Kane and Sarah had an easy relationship, teasing each other gently about various ranch matters. Thomas explained more about the household routine and what would be expected of her, and Louise listened carefully, asking questions about their preferences and Sarah's schedule. Sarah remained quiet and withdrawn when Louise addressed her directly, but she did not leave the table or cause trouble. After breakfast, Kane and Thomas headed out to work on the ranch. Louise learned that Thomas owned over 1,000 acres of grazing land and raised cattle and horses, with Kane serving as his foreman and right-hand man. Kane lived in a small cabin near the main barn, but he took most of his meals at the house. Louise set about cleaning the kitchen, and then began a systematic assessment of what needed to be done throughout the house. The neglect of 3 months without a woman's care was evident everywhere. Dust covered surfaces, windows were streaked, mending had piled up, and the whole house needed a thorough cleaning. Louise rolled up her sleeves and got to work, grateful to have something productive to focus on. Sarah disappeared to her room, claiming she had studies to do, and Louise did not push her. Grieving children needed space and time. Louise spent the day cleaning and organizing, stopping at midday to make a simple lunch of sandwiches and soup. She called Sarah to eat, and the girl came reluctantly, but she did eat everything on her plate. In the afternoon, Louise focused on mending the clothes she found in the basket by the fireplace, her skilled fingers flying through the work. She had always been good with a needle, and she found satisfaction in making torn shirts whole again and replacing missing buttons. She was preparing dinner when Kane came in from the barn, covered in dust and looking tired. He washed up at the basin by the door and then approached the kitchen, drawn by the smells of roasting chicken and fresh bread. "That smells incredible. We have been living on mostly beans and bacon for months." Louise smiled, basting the chicken. "I enjoy cooking. My mother taught me before she passed. She always said a good meal could comfort the soul as well as the body." She was right about that. Kane leaned against the doorframe, watching her work. "How was your first day?" "Productive. There is much to do, but I like being busy." "Sarah is keeping her distance, but I expected that. She needs time." Kane nodded thoughtfully. "She has been through a hard time. Margaret's death was sudden, a fever that took her in less than a week. Sarah and Thomas are both still reeling from it. Margaret was the heart of this house." "I am not trying to replace her," Louise said quietly. "I could never do that. I am just trying to help. I know. And they know that too, even if Sarah is not ready to admit it yet." Kane shifted, looking almost uncertain. "I wanted to say, what I did last night, bringing you here without real warning, it was forward of me. I just could not leave you on the street, and I thought this might work out, but I should have asked you properly instead of just assuming." Louise turned to face him fully, surprised by his concern. "You saved my life, Kane. I am quite certain I would have frozen to death if you had not found me. You have nothing to apologize for. I am grateful beyond words." Something flickered in Kane's eyes, an emotion Louise could not quite name. "You did not deserve what Marcus did to you. That was cruel and public and unnecessary." "No, I did not deserve it," Louise agreed, a hint of steel entering her voice. "But I am beginning to think it might have been a blessing in disguise. I do not think I would have been happy as Mrs. Marcus Thornton." Kane's face broke into a genuine smile, transforming his features. "No, I do not think you would have been. Marcus is the kind of man who values appearance over substance. His loss is our gain." Over the next several weeks, Louise settled into the rhythm of life at the Running Q Ranch. She rose early each morning to make breakfast, spent her days cleaning, mending, and managing the household, and prepared hearty dinners each evening. The work was hard but satisfying, and she felt herself growing stronger as proper food and regular sleep restored her health. Sarah remained distant, but Louise was patient. She did not try to mother the girl or force affection, instead simply being a steady, kind presence. She mended Sarah's dresses without being asked, left small treats on her bedside table, and offered help with her studies when Sarah struggled with mathematics. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Sarah began to thaw. Kane was a constant presence, taking his meals at the house, and often staying after dinner to play chess with Thomas or help Sarah with her homework. Louise found herself increasingly aware of him, noticing the way he always held doors for her, how he complimented her cooking with genuine appreciation, and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. He treated her with unfailing respect and courtesy, but there was something else there too, a warmth in his gaze that made her heart beat faster. Christmas came 2 weeks after Louise's arrival, and she worked hard to make it special despite the limited time to prepare. She baked cookies and pies, convinced Thomas to let her buy a few small gifts in town, and decorated the house with pine boughs and red ribbons. On Christmas morning, Sarah's face lit up with genuine happiness for the first time since Louise had arrived, and Thomas had tears in his eyes as he thanked her for bringing joy back to their home. Kane gave Louise a gift that surprised her, a beautiful shawl in deep green wool that he admitted his late aunt had helped him choose from the general store. "The color matches your eyes," he said simply, and Louise felt her cheeks warm as she thanked him. January brought bitter cold and several snowstorms that kept them all close to the house. Louise taught Sarah to knit, and they spent evenings by the fire working on a blanket together, while Thomas read aloud from novels and newspapers. Kane often joined them, and Louise treasured those peaceful hours more than she wanted to admit. She caught herself watching him when she thought he was not looking, admiring the quiet competence with which he did everything, the gentle patience he showed with Sarah, and the respect he offered Thomas. One evening in late January, after Sarah had gone to bed and Thomas had retired to his room, Louise was finishing the dishes when Kane came in from checking on the horses one final time. Snow dusted his hat and shoulders, and his cheeks were red from the cold. Still snowing. Louise asked, drying the last plate, "Coming down heavy. We will have a good foot by morning, I think." Kane removed his coat and hung it up, then moved to warm his hands by the fire. "You have transformed this house, Louise. It feels like a home again." Louise joined him by the fire, holding her own cold hands out to the warmth. "I am glad. Everyone here has been so kind to me. I feel fortunate to have found a place here." Kane was quiet for a moment, and when Louise glanced at him, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Louise, I need to tell you something. I have been thinking about this for weeks, and I cannot keep it to myself any longer." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "That day at the train station when I saw Marcus reject you, I was angry. Angry at him for his cruelty, angry at the injustice of it, but I was also relieved." He turned to face her fully. "I know that makes me sound terrible, but it is the truth. Because from the moment I saw you standing there, trying so hard to be brave even though you were terrified, something in my chest just knew. I have spent every day since then trying to convince myself I was being foolish, that you needed time and space, that you had just escaped one situation and did not need a man pressuring you into another. But I cannot pretend anymore, Louise. I am falling in love with you." Louise stared at him, her mind reeling. She had not let herself even consider that Kane might feel the same pull she felt, the same growing attachment that went far beyond gratitude or friendship. "Kane, you do not have to say anything," Kane interrupted quickly. "I am not asking for anything. I just needed you to know. You are not just perfect for this house or this family. You are perfect for me. Everything about you, your strength, your kindness, your determination. The way you sing while you work and the way you laugh at Thomas's terrible jokes. The patience you show Sarah and the care you put into every meal. I have never met anyone like you, and I know I probably never will again." Louise felt tears prick her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. "Can I speak now?" Kane nodded, looking nervous in a way she had never seen him look before. "I have been falling in love with you too," Louise said softly. "I did not want to. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that you were just being kind, that I was confusing gratitude with deeper feelings. But it is not gratitude, Kane. It is love. Real love, the kind I had stopped believing in." Kane's expression transformed with joy and relief, and he reached out to cup her face gently in his work-roughened hands. "May I kiss you?" "Yes," Louise whispered, and Kane lowered his mouth to hers in a kiss that was tender and sweet and full of promise. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Kane rested his forehead against hers. "I want to court you properly. I want to do this right. Will you let me?" "Yes," Louise said again, happiness bubbling up inside her like champagne. "Yes, Kane." They stood there by the fire for a long moment, simply holding each other, and Louise marveled at how much her life had changed in just 2 months. She had come to Rawhide expecting to marry a man she did not love, only to be rejected and left with nothing. But that rejection had led her here, to this house, and this man and this life that felt more right than anything she had ever known. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Louise had experienced. Kane was attentive and romantic in ways both large and small. He brought her wildflowers when the spring thaw began, taught her to ride a gentle mare named Daisy, and sat with her on the porch in the evenings talking about their dreams and hopes for the future. He asked about her life in Boston and listened with genuine interest to her stories. He made her laugh with his dry wit and held her when she cried about the mother she still missed. Sarah warmed to their relationship quickly, seeming to understand that Kane's happiness meant good things for their family. She started calling Louise by her first name instead of Miss Ramsey, and began seeking her out for help with problems both practical and emotional. Louise cherished the growing bond between them, knowing that being a stepmother to Sarah would be one of the greatest joys of her life. Thomas gave his blessing enthusiastically, confiding to Louise that he had been hoping for exactly this outcome since the day Kane had brought her to the ranch. "Margaret would have liked you very much," he told her one afternoon, "and she would have been thrilled to see Kane so happy. He has always been like a son to me, and I cannot think of anyone I would rather have as a daughter-in-law." In April, when the desert was blooming with wildflowers and the weather had turned warm and beautiful, Kane proposed properly. He took Louise on a picnic to a spot overlooking the ranch, with views of the distant mountains and the vast Nevada sky stretching endlessly overhead. He got down on one knee and produced a simple gold ring that had belonged to his grandmother. "Louise Ramsey, you are the strongest, kindest, most remarkable woman I have ever known. You took a terrible situation and turned it into something beautiful. You brought light back into this house and into my life. I love you more than I thought it was possible to love someone." Will you marry me and let me spend the rest of my life trying to make you as happy as you make me?" Louise was crying and laughing at the same time as she pulled him to his feet. "Yes, Kane Quincy. Yes, I will marry you. I love you so much." The ring fit perfectly, and as Kane slipped it onto her finger, Louise thought about how strange and wonderful life could be. She had traveled across the country to marry one man, only to be rejected in the cruelest possible way. But that rejection had been the door that opened to her real future, to a love that was genuine and deep and true. They were married in June in the small church in Rawhide, with Sarah as Louise's attendant and Thomas as Kane's best man. The whole town turned out for the wedding, and if anyone remembered the humiliation of Louise's rejection 6 months earlier, they had the grace not to mention it. Louise wore a simple white dress she had sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair, and she had never felt more beautiful than she did when she saw the love shining in Kane's eyes as she walked down the aisle. The reception was held at the ranch, with tables set up in the yard and enough food to feed half the county. People danced to fiddle music as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and gold. Louise danced with Kane, with Thomas, and even with Sarah, who was old enough now to feel the romance of the occasion. As night fell and the guests began to leave, Kane and Louise stood together watching the stars emerge one by one in the vast desert sky. Kane had added a room to his cabin, transforming it into a proper home for a married couple, and they would move there tomorrow. But tonight, standing in the place where their story had begun, Louise felt overwhelmed with gratitude. "What are you thinking about?" Kane asked softly, his arm around her waist. "I am thinking about how that day at the train station was the worst day of my life," Louise said, "and how it led to the best days of my life. I am thinking about how you saw me at my lowest point, cold and rejected and desperate, and you said I was perfect for you." Kane turned her to face him, his hands on her shoulders. "You were perfect for me. You are perfect for me, not despite what you had been through, but because of it. Because you were strong enough to survive it, brave enough to start over, and generous enough to open your heart again. I fell in love with the woman who stood on that platform trying to maintain her dignity even as her world fell apart. And I fall more in love with you every single day." Louise kissed him, pouring all her love and joy and hope into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, she rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "I love you, Kane Quincy. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for saving me. You saved yourself, Louise." "I just provided the horse." Kane smiled against her hair. "But I will happily take credit for recognizing a good thing when I saw it." They stood there together under the stars, surrounded by the people who had become their family, in the place that had become their home. Louise thought about all the miles she had traveled and all the hardships she had endured to get to this moment, and she knew she would do it all again in a heartbeat if it meant ending up right here, right now, in the arms of the man she loved. The first year of their marriage was everything Louise had dreamed marriage could be. Kane was an attentive husband, thoughtful and affectionate, always making her feel cherished and valued. They worked together seamlessly, building their life one day at a time. Kane continued to work as foreman of the running queue, but he also began building up his own small herd of cattle with Thomas's blessing and support. Louise managed their household and continued to help Thomas and Sarah at the main house several days a week. She had become truly close with Sarah, who at 13 was navigating the difficult transition from childhood to young womanhood. Sarah came to Louise with questions and concerns she could not take to her father, and Louise offered guidance with all the love and patience she would have shown her own daughter. The community of Rawhide had fully accepted Louise as well. She joined the Church Ladies' Auxiliary and helped organize charity drives for families in need. She taught sewing classes for young girls and became known for her skill with a needle. People no longer looked at her with pity or curiosity, but with respect and affection. She had built a life here through her own efforts, and she was proud of it. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Louise discovered she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be sure before telling Kane. When she finally shared the news, Kane's reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He picked her up and spun her around, then immediately set her down carefully, afraid he might hurt her. His joy and excitement were so pure and genuine that Louise felt tears streaming down her face as she laughed. "We are going to have a baby," Kane kept saying, as though he could not quite believe it. "We are going to be parents." "We are," Louise confirmed, taking his hands and placing them on her still flat stomach. "In October, if my calculations are correct." Kane pulled her close, holding her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "I am going to be a father. Lord help me, I hope I can be a good one." "You already are a good father," Louise said, thinking of his relationship with Sarah. "You are going to be wonderful." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the spring and summer. Louise continued her work as long as she could, though both Kane and Thomas fussed over her constantly, trying to keep her from doing anything strenuous. Sarah was thrilled about the baby and spent hours helping Louise prepare the nursery and sew tiny clothes. In early October, Louise went into labor on a crisp fall morning. The midwife from town came out to the ranch, and Kane stayed by Louise's side through the long hours, holding her hand and offering encouragement. Sarah and Thomas waited anxiously in the main house, and Louise could hear their voices occasionally drifting through the window. After 12 hours of labor, Louise gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Kane cried when the midwife placed their son in his arms, tears streaming down his face as he looked at the tiny, perfect human they had created. "He is beautiful, Louise. He is perfect." Louise, exhausted but euphoric, reached up to touch her husband's face. "What should we name him?" They had discussed names for months but had never quite settled on anything. Now, looking at their son's tiny features, Kane said, "What about William Quincy? We can call him Will." "Will Quincy," Louise repeated, testing the name. "I love it. Hello, Will. Welcome to the world, little one." Sarah came in a few minutes later, her eyes wide with wonder as she looked at the baby. "He is so small. Can I hold him?" Kane carefully transferred the baby to Sarah's arms, showing her how to support his head. Sarah looked down at Will with an expression of fierce love and protection, and Louise knew that their son would have the best big sister in the world. The next few months were a blur of sleepless nights and endless baby care, but Louise had never been happier. Kane was an involved father, getting up with her for night feedings, and taking Will for walks around the property when he was fussy. The whole family doted on the baby, and even the ranch hands would stop by to peek at the newest member of the Kane Quincy family. As Will grew from a tiny newborn into a chubby, cheerful baby, Louise would often sit in the rocking chair Kane had built for her and reflect on the journey that had brought her to this place. She thought about that desperate, frozen girl standing on the train platform, rejected and alone and terrified. She thought about Kane finding her huddled behind the church, barely conscious from the cold. She thought about all the moments in between, the gradual thawing of her heart, the slow building of trust, the moment she realized she was in love. Marcus Thornton had done her the greatest favor of her life when he rejected her that bitter December day. He had unknowingly freed her to find her real destiny, her real home, her real love. Louise had heard through the town gossip that Marcus had married the elegant woman from the train station, but that the marriage was reportedly cold and difficult. Louise felt no satisfaction in that news, only a mild pity for both of them. She was too happy in her own life to spare much thought for what might have been. Will grew into a curious, adventurous toddler who kept Louise constantly on her toes. He had Kane's blue-green eyes and Louise's dark hair, and his laughter could light up the darkest day. Sarah, now 15, was wonderful with him, taking on many of the duties of a beloved older sister. She had grown into a lovely young woman, and Louise was proud of the role she had played in that transformation. When Will was 2 years old, Louise became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was more difficult, with considerable morning sickness that lasted well into the second trimester. Kane was even more protective than before, and Louise had to practically fight him to be allowed to do basic household tasks. But she did not really mind his fussing. It came from a place of love and concern, and she felt cherished and cared for. Their daughter was born on a warm May evening in 1888, arriving quickly and easily compared to Will's lengthy labor. Kane cried again when he held his daughter for the first time, and Louise teased him gently about being soft-hearted. They named her Margaret after Thomas's late wife, and the elderly rancher wept openly when they told him. Maggie would have loved that, Thomas said, his voice choked with emotion. And Margaret would have loved knowing there is a new little one carrying her name. Thank you, both of you. Little Margaret, quickly nicknamed Maggie, was a calm, sweet-natured baby who seemed content to observe the world with solemn dark eyes. Will was fascinated by his baby sister and wanted to help with everything, though his help was often more hindrance than assistance. Louise managed it all with patience and humor, supported by Kane's unwavering love and Thomas's grandfatherly presence. The running queue continued to prosper, and Kane's own herd had grown substantially. He and Louise talked about eventually building a larger house and establishing their own ranch, but there was no rush. They were happy where they were, part of the extended family that included Thomas and Sarah. Sarah left for boarding school in San Francisco when she turned 16, wanting to get a proper education and see something of the world beyond Nevada. It was a bittersweet parting, but Louise was proud of the confident young woman Sarah had become. They corresponded regularly, and Sarah came home for holidays and summers, always bearing gifts for Will and Maggie and full of stories about her experiences. The years flowed by with the rhythm of seasons and the milestones of children growing. Will started school in Rawhide, walking to town with the neighbor children each morning. Maggie grew from a quiet baby into a talkative, imaginative little girl who loved stories and flowers. Louise added to the family garden each year, creating a haven of roses and vegetables that became her pride and joy. Kane and Louise's love deepened and matured with time, weathering the challenges of parenthood and ranch life and growing stronger through it all. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings after the children were asleep, talking about everything and nothing, their hands intertwined. Kane still brought her wildflowers and told her she was beautiful. Louise still baked his favorite pie and left him love notes in his lunch pail. When Will was 8 years old and Maggie was 6, Thomas passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 72. It was a profound loss for the entire family. Thomas had been a steady, loving presence in all their lives, and his absence left a hole that ached. They buried him next to Margaret on a hillside overlooking the ranch, with a view of the mountains he had loved. Sarah came home for the funeral and stayed for several months to help settle the estate. Thomas had left the running queue to Kane, along with a substantial sum of money, recognizing that Kane had been the one truly running the ranch for years. Sarah received her own inheritance, enough to ensure her security and independence. She had become a teacher in San Francisco and loved her work, but she promised to visit often. Taking ownership of the running queue was both an honor and a responsibility that Kane took seriously. He expanded the operation carefully, hiring good men, and building the ranch's reputation for quality cattle and horses. Louise managed the business side of things, keeping the books and handling correspondence with their usual efficiency and skill. As the 1890s began, Rawhide was changing and growing. The railroad brought more people and commerce, and the town was becoming more civilized. There was talk of bringing telephone lines to the area, and some of the wealthier families had even installed indoor plumbing. Kane and Louise watched these changes with interest, selectively adopting innovations that made sense for their lifestyle while maintaining the values and traditions they held dear. Will grew into a serious, hard-working boy who loved the ranch and wanted nothing more than to follow in his father's footsteps. He learned to ride almost before he could walk and spent every available moment with Kane, absorbing knowledge about cattle and horses and land management. Kane was patient and thorough in his teaching, and Louise loved watching the bond between father and son deepen. Maggie was different, dreamy and artistic, more interested in books and drawing than in ranch work. She had Louise's hazel eyes and a creative soul that needed nurturing. Louise encouraged her daughter's interests while also teaching her practical skills, knowing that a woman needed to be capable and self-sufficient regardless of her artistic inclinations. In 1893, when Will was 11 and Maggie was 9, Louise discovered she was pregnant once more. It was unexpected, as she had assumed she was finished having children, but both she and Kane were delighted. This pregnancy was the easiest of the three, and Louise felt wonderful throughout. Their second son was born on a snowy December day, exactly 10 years after Louise had arrived in Rawhide cold and rejected and alone. Kane remarked on the timing, holding their newborn son and looking at Louise with so much love it made her chest tight. 10 years ago today, my life changed forever. And here we are, blessed beyond measure. They named him Thomas Kane Quincy, honoring the man who had welcomed Louise into his home and given Kane his first real opportunity. Little Thomas, called Tommy, was a joyful, energetic baby who rarely cried and smiled at everyone. Will and Maggie were old enough to truly help with the baby, and the whole family doted on him. As Louise nursed Tommy in the rocking chair that had held all three of her babies, she thought about the fullness of her life. She had a husband who loved her deeply and showed it every day. She had 3 beautiful children who were healthy and happy. She had a home that was comfortable and welcoming. She had friends in the community and respect earned through her own efforts. She had everything she had ever dreamed of and so much more. Sometimes, very rarely, she would think about Marcus Thornton and wonder what her life would have been like if he had not rejected her. Would she have been content as his wife, living in town and focusing on social appearances? Would she have had children? Would she have been happy? The answer was always the same. No, she would not have been happy. She would have had a comfortable life perhaps, a respectable life, but not this life. Not this love. Kane found her there one evening, Tommy asleep in her arms, tears streaming silently down her face. He knelt beside the rocking chair, concerned. "Louise, what is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Louise said, smiling through her tears. "Everything is so right it overwhelms me sometimes. I am just grateful, Kane. So grateful for all of this, for you." Kane kissed her forehead, then her lips, gentle and sweet. "I am the grateful one. You have given me everything, Louise. A family, a home, a purpose. You are the best thing that ever happened to me." "You saved my life," Louise reminded him. "That day you found me behind the church, I was dying." "I know I was. You saved me." "No," Kane said firmly. "I helped you when you needed it, but you saved yourself. You were strong enough to survive, brave enough to start over, and wise enough to build a new life. All I did was point you in the right direction. You did the rest." "We did it together," Louise said, and Kane nodded, accepting that. The years continued their steady march forward. Sarah married a kind doctor from San Francisco and eventually moved back to Nevada with him, settling in Rawhide where he opened a practice. She had 2 children of her own, and the cousins grew up close despite the age gap. Louise loved being an aunt figure to Sarah's children and watching Sarah blossom as a mother. Will grew into a tall, capable young man who took on more and more responsibility at the ranch. At 18, he was already indispensable to Kane, managing the hands and making decisions with confidence and wisdom beyond his years. Maggie went to boarding school like Sarah had, studying art and literature, but she returned home regularly and eventually decided she wanted to teach in the local school rather than move to a big city. Tommy grew up the baby of the family, spoiled and loved by everyone, but somehow managing not to be a brat. He had Kane's sense of humor and Louise's way with people, and he could charm birds from trees when he wanted to. He was fascinated by everything, curious and enthusiastic about life in a way that brought joy to everyone around him. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Kane took Louise back to the spot where he had proposed, high on the hill overlooking the ranch. 2 decades had passed since that day, and both of them showed the marks of time and hard work. Kane's hair was graying at the temples, and Louise had lines around her eyes from years of squinting into the Nevada sun. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the people they had fallen in love with, the determined young woman who refused to give up, and the kind cowboy who had recognized her worth when no one else did. 20 years, Kane marveled, holding Louise's hand. It has gone by so fast. And so slow, Louise added. We have lived an entire lifetime together, Kane. Raised children, built a home, created a legacy, and I would not change a single moment of it. Not even the hard parts, the sick cows and the failed crops and the sleepless nights with crying babies. Especially not those parts, Louise said firmly. Those are the parts that made it real. Easy love is not worth much, Kane. It is the love that survives hardship and struggle and still comes out stronger that matters. That is what we have. Kane pulled her close, and they stood there together as the sun set over their land, their home, their life. In the distance, they could see the ranch house where their children were probably starting to wonder where they were. Smoke rose from the chimney and lights glowed in the windows, beacons of warmth and welcome. "Do you ever think about that day at the train station?" Kane asked quietly. "Sometimes," Louise admitted, "but not with pain anymore. Only with gratitude. Because every terrible thing that happened to me before I met you was just the road that led me here. And I would walk that road 1,000 times over if it meant ending up with you. You are perfect for me, Louise Quincy. You always have been, right from that first moment, and you always will be." Louise turned in his arms and kissed him, putting 20 years of love and devotion into that kiss. When they finally broke apart, both smiling, the stars were beginning to emerge in the darkening sky. They walked back down the hill hand in hand, heading toward the lights of home and the family waiting for them there. The years that followed were quieter, the rhythm of life settling into a comfortable routine. Will married a sweet girl from town and built a house near the main ranch, planning to eventually take over full management when Kane was ready to step back. Maggie got her teaching certificate and taught at the Rawhide school, beloved by her students for her patience and creativity. Tommy was still at home, now a gangly teenager full of energy and ideas. Kane did step back gradually from the day-to-day operations of the ranch, though he never fully retired. He and Louise spent more time together, taking rides across the property and sitting on the porch in the evenings. They became grandparents when Will and his wife had a son, and then a daughter, and Louise discovered the unique joy of holding her grandchildren and knowing she was part of a continuing legacy. When Louise turned 50, Kane threw her a surprise party at the ranch, inviting everyone they knew. The house and yard were filled with people whose lives Louise had touched over the years students Maggie taught. Families Louise had helped through hard times, ranch hands who had worked for them, friends from church and community organizations. Sarah came with her family from town, and even distant relatives traveled to attend. As Louise stood in the center of the celebration, surrounded by love and laughter, she was overwhelmed by the richness of her life. She had started with nothing, no family, no money, no prospects. She had been rejected and humiliated and left to freeze on the streets of a strange town. But from those ashes, she had built something beautiful. She had created a family, a home, a life worth living. Kane found her later in the evening standing alone for a moment on the porch, looking out at the land she had come to love. He wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything," Louise said softly. "All of it. The whole journey from there to here. Any regrets?" "Not a single one." Louise turned in his arms to face him. "I would do it all again, Kane. Every hardship, every struggle, every moment of fear and uncertainty, because it led me to you and you are worth everything." Kane kissed her tenderly, their 50th birthday kiss as sweet as their first kiss had been all those years ago by the fire. "I love you, Louise. More than I did the day we married, which I would not have thought possible. You are still perfect for me." "And you are perfect for me," Louise whispered back. "Always and forever." They stood there together as the party continued behind them, two people who had found each other against all odds and built a love that would last a lifetime. The stars wheeled overhead in their eternal dance, and the Nevada wind whispered through the sage brush, carrying the promise of tomorrow. As they aged together, Kane and Louise remained deeply in love, their bond strengthened by decades of partnership and devotion. They watched their children grow into capable, loving adults who carried forward the values they had instilled. They delighted in their grandchildren, and eventually their great-grandchildren, always making time for the youngest members of the family. Louise continued her sewing and her garden, finding joy in the simple acts of creation. Kane still brought her wildflowers, even when he had to walk with a cane to do so. They still sat together on the porch in the evenings, their hands intertwined, talking about their day and their dreams and their memories. On their 40th wedding anniversary, they renewed their vows in the same church where they had married, surrounded by 4 generations of family. Louise wore a new dress she had sewn herself, and Kane wore his best suit, and when they spoke their vows with tears streaming down their weathered faces, there was not a dry eye in the church. "I, Kane Quincy, take you, Louise Ramsey Quincy, to continue to be my wife," Kane said, his voice strong despite his age. 40 years ago, I promised to love you and cherish you for the rest of my life. That was the easiest promise I ever made and the most joyful one to keep. You have been my partner, my companion, my best friend, and my love. You are still perfect for me, and you always will be." Louise smiled through her tears. "I, Louise Ramsey Quincy, take you, Kane Quincy, to continue to be my husband. You found me when I was lost and saved me when I was desperate. But more than that, you loved me when I needed love most. You saw worth in me when others saw only failure. You built a life with me and gave me a family and a home. You are my heart, Kane, and you always will be." As they sealed their renewed vows with a kiss, the congregation erupted in applause and cheers. It was a celebration not just of their love, but of the life they had built together and the legacy they would leave behind. Louise and Kane lived to see the new century arrive, watching as 1899 turned to 1900 with wonder and hope. They had lived through tremendous changes: the closing of the frontier, the rise of new technologies, the slow march of progress that transformed the Wild West into something more civilized and settled. But through it all, their love had remained constant, a fixed point in a changing world. When Kane passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 75, surrounded by his family in the house he had shared with Louise for over 40 years, Louise held his hand and whispered all the words of love she had said 1,000 times before. She told him he was perfect for her, that he had given her everything, that she would love him forever. In the days after his death, Louise grieved deeply but without regret. She had had more years with Kane than many people ever got with their great loves, and every single one of those years had been a gift. She missed him with an ache that went bone deep, but she also knew that she had been incredibly blessed. Louise lived for another 5 years after Kane's death, spending her time with her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, tending her garden and working on her sewing. She told stories about the old days to anyone who would listen, keeping the memories alive. She talked about the bitter cold day she arrived in Rawhide, rejected and alone and terrified. She talked about the cowboy who found her and brought her to warmth and safety. She talked about falling in love and building a life and creating a family. When Louise passed away peacefully at the age of 79, surrounded by love and comfort, her last thoughts were of Kane. She could almost feel his hand in hers, could almost hear his voice saying those words that had changed her life. "You are perfect for me." They buried her next to Kane on the hillside, overlooking the Running Q Ranch, with a view of the mountains and the endless Nevada sky. Her gravestone was simple, bearing her name and the dates of her birth and death, and below that, a single line that told the story of her life. Beloved wife, mother, grandmother, and friend. She turned rejection into redemption and found perfect love. The legacy Louise and Kane left behind was not just in the prosperous ranch or the successful descendants, though those things mattered. Their true legacy was in the love they had shown each other and shared with everyone around them. They had proven that the worst moments could lead to the best outcomes, that rejection could open the door to something better, and that true love was worth waiting for and fighting for and cherishing for a lifetime. In the years that followed, as the 20th century progressed and the world continued to change, the story of Louise and Kane became a treasured family legend. Grandchildren and great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren heard about the mail-order bride who was rejected in the bitter cold, and the cowboy who found her and recognized her worth. They heard about the love that grew from that desperate beginning, a love so strong and true that it sustained them through decades of life's challenges and joys. And in the retelling of that story, in the preservation of that memory, Louise and Kane's love lived on. Because some loves are too powerful to be contained by a single lifetime. Some loves become part of the fabric of a family, woven into the stories that define who they are and where they came from. Some loves change not just 2 lives, but generations of lives that follow. Louise Ramsey had come to Rawhide, Nevada, on a bitter December day in 1883, expecting to marry a man who did not want her. Instead, she found something infinitely better. A man who saw her true worth, a family who welcomed her, a community that accepted her, and a life that fulfilled her in ways she had never imagined possible. She had been rejected in the cold, but she had been embraced in the warmth. She had been told she was not good enough, but Kane had said she was perfect. And in the end, that made all the difference. The Running Q Ranch continues to operate to this day, passed down through the generations of the Quincy family. The original homestead still stands, lovingly maintained and preserved as a reminder of the couple who built it into something special. Visitors can see the rocking chair where Louise nursed her babies, the porch where she and Kane sat together in the evenings, and the hillside where they rest side by side, their love story complete. On quiet evenings, when the wind whispers through the sage brush and the stars wheel overhead in their eternal dance, some say you can still feel the love that Louise and Kane shared. It is in the very bones of the place, woven into the land itself. A testament to the power of second chances, the beauty of unexpected blessings, and the enduring strength of a love that was truly perfect.